and call upon and introduce Nan Shellabarger, who is our Executive Director of Aviation Policy and Plans at the FAA, to brief publicly for the first time our aviation forecast for 2012 through 2032. Nan's office is responsible for providing policy and planning services for issues that cover all of the FAA. She joined the FAA in 1997, and now as Executive Director, she is responsible for FAA policy and strategic planning, our long-range aviation forecasts, and economic analysis to support our safety and operational rulemaking activities. She came to the FAA from United Airlines, where she held a number of financial management and operations research positions. She holds an MBA and Bachelor of Science degrees from the University of Michigan, my alma mater, and is a private pilot with an instrument rating. So please join me in welcoming Nan to the podium.
Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. The panel is going to join me on stage here. We'll do the introductions after I have run through the elements of the forecast. All right, to get right to it, here's what I'll be covering today. First, I'll do a quick review of 2011. Then I'll talk about the assumptions underpinning the forecast. Then I'll talk about the forecast itself, going through traffic and activity, and then cover FAA workload. Finally, I'll talk about risks and summarize the elements of the forecast. To begin with a review of 2011, I'd have to characterize it as a mixed bag. Traffic growth was modest, passengers were up 2.5%, RPMs were up 3.5%. The main line grew faster than regionals in both domestic and international markets. International traffic grew faster than domestic. Yield continued to rise sharply in 2011. System-wide yield was up 6.2%, with domestic yield overall 4.6%, while international was up 10% for the second year in a row. A combination of modest traffic growth coupled with a sharp increase in yields resulted in another year of profits for the industry. Operating profits were $7.6 billion overall, while net income was $1.6 billion. FAA workload was mixed. Tower activity fell while en route activity was up. Tower activity was down 1% overall, with commercial activity up slightly and non-commercial down 2%. En route aircraft handled was up 1.8%, the fastest growth we've seen since 2005. Commercial en route was up 4.8%, while non-commercial was down. Turning to the key assumptions underpinning this forecast, I want to mention that the economic and energy assumptions are not forecast independently by the FAA, but rather we base them on forecasts made available by IHS Global Insight. Long-run economic growth in both the U.S. and the world is modest. U.S. growth averages 2.6 per year out to 2032. World growth will average 3.2% per year. The price of oil will remain high, and it grows at a steady rate through the forecast. IHS Global Insight is forecasting that oil prices will remain above $100 a barrel and grow steadily. We assume domestic capacity remains in check. Not until 2016 do we get back to 2007 levels. A number of factors, such as slow economic growth and high fuel prices, are driving this, but consolidation in the industry is one of the major factors for the immediate future. Consolidation leads to a shrinking network, fewer cities served, fewer flights, resulting in slow growth in domestic capacity. Finally, our forecast is demand-driven. The projected demand is based on underlying economic and demographic forecasts, and at the national level is not materially impacted by environmental or infrastructure constraints. Reviewing the U.S. GDP forecast from IHS Global Insight, we can see that they're calling for a more subdued recovery than they were at this time last year. The red bars are this year's forecast, the blue bars are last year's. Continued concerns about debt, higher energy prices, uncertainty over taxes, and resolution of the Eurozone debt crisis serve to keep the growth of the U.S. economy in check. Recent data suggests that our 2012 growth assumption might, however, be low. Over the long run, the U.S. economy is projected to grow at modest rates, 2.6% per year, similar to what we assumed in last year's forecast. Let me take a moment to explain the format of this slide, since I'll be using the same format in several of the subsequent slides. You probably can't see the legend from the cheap seats in back. I'm showing 15 years of history starting in 1996 and 20 years of projections out to 2032. The white line shows last year's forecast with this year's forecast in red. Oil prices were 27% higher in 2011 than we'd assumed in last year's forecast. Prices are projected to remain high in 2012 and climb through 2018. Thereafter, prices flatten out till around 24-25 and then start climbing again for the remainder of the forecast. In terms of numbers, this forecast is calling for oil breaking $110 a barrel by 2015, exceeding $125 by 2028, and approaching $140 by the end of the forecast. We've also got some scenarios that show an optimistic and a pessimistic case. In this optimistic case, shown here in yellow, the price of oil falls in the near term and remains below $100 a barrel through 2016, and then remains between 100 and 110 and 115 for the balance of the forecast. In the pessimistic case, shown here in orange, oil prices continue to rise for the next several years, but they cross $150 per barrel in 2025 and approach $200 per barrel by the end of the forecast period. Turning now to the FAA forecasts of aviation activity. Looking at the passenger forecast, we've trimmed our projections of future growth in line with the state of the airline industry and economic conditions. In the near term, we see a pause in growth for this year. Passengers are essentially unchanged from 2011 levels, but afterwards, modest increases are projected at around 2.5% per year overall. By the end of the forecast period in 2032, we're projecting that U.S. carriers will transport more than 1.2 billion passengers, 500 million more than current levels. We ran the optimistic and pessimistic scenarios, and we see in the optimistic case, stronger economic growth and lower energy prices propel passengers to 9% higher than in the baseline. In the pessimistic case, by the end of the forecast, system passengers are just below 1.1 billion, 12% below the baseline. Looking at revenue passenger miles, we see a pattern similar to the passenger forecast. A near-term pause is followed by modest increases over the long run. More specifically, we project system RPMs will increase by 0.5% in 2012 and then grow faster through 2015. It reverts back to a trend growth rate of 3.3% per year for the balance of the forecast. By the end of the forecast period in 2032, we're projecting that U.S. carrier RPMs will be 1.57 trillion, 93% above or nearly double the level in 2011. If we look at the RPM totals in the optimistic and pessimistic cases, again we see the optimistic case with stronger economic growth and lower energy prices drive RPMs to 10% above the baseline. In the pessimistic case, the opposite occurs, and by the end of the forecast, RPMs are 13.5% below the baseline. We think these provide reasonable boundaries of where the future will lie. Passenger demand has to be accommodated on airline flights, and how this demand will be accommodated is of key concern to the FAA in projecting the number of operations we'll be handling in the national airspace system. Will the passengers be in many small planes making many, many flights, or in very big, very full planes? Look at what's happened to load factors over the past 15 years. The last decade saw huge increases from just over 70% to last year's 82%. And so the increases in passengers historically were at least partly accommodated by fuller airplanes rather than more flights. We continue to wonder what the practical limit on load factor is. I'm pretty confident it's less than 100%, but exactly how much less, we're really not sure. We ran a little survey before this conference. Many of you answered the question, and we saw that many of you think that load factors of 85 to 90% and possibly even higher may be practical. Our look is a little different. While we see planes remaining quite full over the forecast, we project load factor increasing only very slightly from 82% in 2011 to 83.4% in 2032. And this is pretty much the same picture we had last year. This is the system load factor. Domestic load factor is projected to approach 85%, while load factor in international markets will hover around 81% for the duration of the forecast. With load factors as high as they are, do we see any big increases in the average size of the aircraft? The answer is no on average. This chart shows our fleet metric, seats per aircraft mile, for selected years for the total domestic fleet. It was 130 seats in '96. It fell by 10 seats on average by 2006 and has grown since then. We project in 2032 it will be at 126 seats per aircraft mile. But when you divide the numbers into mainline, the blue bars, and regionals, the orange bars, the picture's a little bit different. Each separate fleet has grown and will grow over this period. We're projecting the regional aircraft size to increase by about 10 seats per aircraft mile over the forecast period, and mainline aircraft by less than 2 seats. Yield, the revenue per passenger mile, has declined over the course of 2 decades. But lately, we've seen yield firm up as airlines have accommodated rising demand without adding aircraft. With the passenger demand I've shown, a pause this year, modest growth afterwards, combined with the room to accommodate that demand on only slightly larger aircraft with slightly higher load factors, our outlook for real yield is more robust than in past years. We're projecting that airline yield, the revenue per mile, will continue to increase in 2012. After that, we see relative stability for a number of years and then gradual decreases. The stability is the result in a large part of the structural changes in the airline industry since the middle of the last decade, specifically the effects of consolidation. In essence, they've been able to keep capacity more in line with demand, resulting in pricing power for the airlines. Towards the end of the decade, we're assuming that a healthier U.S. economy and the accompanying growth in demand will open up opportunities again for competition, and that will lead to the declines in real yield we're forecasting. Turning to cargo for a moment, unlike our passenger and traffic forecasts, we're projecting that cargo demand will be growing at rates similar to those in last year's forecast. We're projecting that cargo RTMs will increase at a rate of 4.9% per year over the course of the forecast. However, growth rates for domestic markets are slower than international, with domestic cargo RTMs projected to increase at just 1.6% per year, while international cargo RTMs are projected to increase 6% per year for the next 20 years, one of the most robust sectors in aviation. Let's take a look at international markets. We're focusing here on passengers between regions on both U.S. and foreign carriers. Overall, we're projecting that international passengers will grow at an average rate of 4.1% per year over the course of the forecast, increasing from an estimated 162 million in 2011 to 376 million by 2032. We're projecting specifically the transborder region to Canada will grow at 3% per year. Passengers to and from Latin America and the Caribbean is the fastest growing at 4.8% per year. Passengers across the Atlantic to Europe, the Mideast, and Africa will grow by 3.8% per year, and passengers to the Asia-Pacific region will grow by 4.1% per year. Now let's take a look at general aviation. We've revised our GA estimates downward much more than simply accounted for by economic changes. Much of the aging single-engine piston fleet will be retiring without the prospect of complete replacements. This year, we forecast active GA aircraft, which are registered aircraft that fly versus being parked, to not return to 2007 levels until 2023. For the entire forecast period, we're projecting that the active fleet will increase at a rate of 0.6% per year, totaling just over 253,000 by the end of the forecast period. However, not all sectors of the industry will see growth. While the overall fleet is projected to increase 0.6% per year, for the largest component of the fleet, piston aircraft, we're projecting that over the 20 years of the forecast, there will be no growth. There are a lot of older small planes out there, but the relative lack of affordability, lower household wealth, and competition for discretionary dollars are key factors in this pessimistic outlook. For the other components of the fleet, the outlook is more positive. The number of active, experimental, light sport, and other aircraft is projected to increase by almost 30% over the forecast, growing at a rate of 1.2% per year. The turbine fleet is the fastest growing, increasing at a rate of 2.9% per year. Rising corporate profits and a stable economy fuel growth in this sector. Similar to the patterns in the active fleet, we see GA piston hours flown declining through the rest of this decade before growing slowly for the balance of the forecast. By the end of the forecast period, piston hours get back to current levels. Experimental and light sport hours are projected to show steady growth during the forecast period, increasing a total of 71%, or 2.6% per year, on a small base. The real news is the turbine hours. Here we're projecting hours to more than double by 2032, increasing at an average rate of 3.6% per year. A growing fleet, as well as a rebound in the utilization rates, are the primary factors driving the increase in turbine hours. By the end of the forecast period, we project that turbine hours will constitute just under 50% of all GA hours flown, up from the current share of 34%. When you add it all up, overall GA hours are projected to increase at 1.7% per year. Now I want to turn to our forecast of activity at FAA and contract towers. Operations at FAA and contract towers have fallen by 26% from their peak in 2000. During this time, airlines were accommodating the recovery in demand following the 9/11 terror attacks, primarily by rising load factor and a larger set of regional aircraft in the fleet. At the same time, GA activity was declining steadily as flight hours fell. However, the decline in operations that's occurred since 2000 will begin to reverse, and over the course of the forecast, we're projecting that operations will grow at an average annual rate of 1% per year to 62.6 million by 2032, about 20% higher than today. This growth, however, is not at all uniform, so let me explain where it's coming from. Commercial operations at the approximately 500 towered airports are projected to be essentially flat in 2012 because passenger demand is flat. After 2012, we're projecting that commercial operations will increase at a rate of 1.9% per year to just over 32 million operations by the end of the forecast. I showed you the growth in passenger demand and explained that we do not see large increases in load factor or average aircraft size. That means the growth in demand is translated into increased operations. Even with the growth we're projecting, commercial operations don't return overall to 2007 levels until 2019, and at 2005 peak levels by 2021. Commercial operations are projected to be 46% higher by 2032 than current levels. Turning to our forecast of non-commercial operations, mostly GA, the news here is that we've substantially lowered the forecast relative to last year. I've already explained the factors driving the slower growth outlook for GA. In the near term, we're projecting a 2% decline in 2012 after a 2% decline last year. In the longer term, our forecast now calls for non-commercial activity at FAA and contract towers to increase very slowly, 0.3% per year. Another key point with regards to our operations forecast is that the growth in operations is not uniform across airports. While overall growth of operations at our approximately 500 FAA and contract towers is projected to average 1% per year over the forecast, the growth at the largest facilities is projected to be much faster than the growth at the medium or small. This red line here is the operations at the largest airports, the 29 airports that we call the large hubs, and they will grow at an average annual rate of 2% over the forecast. Operations at the medium hubs are forecast to grow at about 1% per year. You can see even though there are more airports, the operations make up a much smaller component of the whole picture. Small hubs and non-hubs have a much larger GA component, and we project the growth in operations at these facilities will only be 0.5% per year on average. You can see by this graph we have an awful lot of small places making up the bulk of takeoffs and landings system-wide. So even with slow growth, a lot of operations are being added to the system. Each of these airports has its own story, so your own individual mileage may vary. Let's look at how growth differs in the biggest airports. For most of the core 30 airports, passenger growth is projected to be between 2 to 3% per year, as I just said, but there are substantial individual differences. The fastest growing facilities are shown here, and they're projected to grow at greater than 3%. This next set of airports in blue are projected to grow between 2.5% to 3%. This set in orange between 2 to 2.5%. And this last set are the slowest growing for passengers at less than 2% per year. Comparing to operations, we see a very similar pattern. For most of the core 30 airports, commercial operations growth is projected to be slightly slower than passenger growth, between 1 to 2% per year, consistent with the national. Here in green are those projected to grow fastest in operations at 2.5% per year. In blue, between 2 and 2.5%. This set here will grow at 1.5% to 2%. And those in red, those in yellow, will be the slowest growing at 1.5% per year. The planes are already full, they're not getting much bigger, and so operations will grow to handle this projected increase in passenger demand. The busy places will continue to get busier. So one thing about the forecasting business is, while you never know exactly what the future is going to hold, I can be pretty sure it's not going to unfold just like I've laid out here. In general, the risk factors to achieving this year's forecast are on the downside. They have more chance of driving activity lower than our projections as opposed to pushing activity up. The first uncertainty is the economy. Our forecast assumes the recovery underway continues, but there are several potential clouds on the horizon. Continuing high debt levels here in Europe and elsewhere, uncertainty about taxes and government spending could lead to a new recession which could result in lower growth in airline traffic and operations. The second risk is energy prices. Our forecast, based on IHS Global Insight, has a relatively benign view of energy prices going forward. Should prices turn out to be higher than our forecast, this could lead to further shifts in consumer expenditures away from aviation, dampening a recovery in air transport demand, as I showed in the scenarios. Another risk is industry consolidation. If there's further consolidation in the U.S. industry, then we'd expect to see less competition, a smaller network with fewer flights, even fuller aircraft, and higher prices, especially in the near to midterm. Environmental concerns represent a fourth risk. New regulatory schemes could retard growth. I think the Secretary covered that. A final risk is congestion. Activity at many of the major airports increased in 2011. We've seen that the most robust growth in demand is projected to be at the already busy places. As demand grows and activity increases, congestion and delays could become a limiting factor over the forecast period. To wrap things up, we see U.S. airline traffic flat this year, but then growing over the next 20 years to nearly double by the end of the forecast. The price of flying in the near and medium term will not fall, but in the long run, we see competition pushing real yield down. In general aviation, the piston fleet in hours will show no net growth over the forecast period. Finally, overall growth in operations at FAA and contract towers is modest over the forecast period, but in general, we see the large airports growing faster than their medium and small counterparts, and there are other individual variations. Thank you very much for your attention.